It was one of those days that starts perfect and ends in a nightmare, the kind of Tuesday that haunts you for the rest of your life. My little brother Danny was only 12, breathless and laughing as he chased me up the spine of Split Ridge. We were miles off the marked trail, exploring a sector of the state park that the rangers warned people to stay away from because of the loose shale. I was 16, invincible and stupid, thinking I was the king of the mountain and that nothing bad could touch us. I didn't see the patch of black algae slicking the granite lip of the overlook until it was too late. I still hear that sound in my sleep, a high-pitched scree of rubber sneaker soles fighting against wet stone and losing the battle. Danny didn't scream right away. He just made this sharp intake of breath, a small gasp of surprise that cut through the wind. I turned around just as his feet went out from under him, his arms windmilling desperately for a handhold that wasn't there. For a split second, our eyes locked, and I saw the pure, confused terror of a child realizing gravity had just betrayed him. Then he tipped backward, vanishing over the edge into the gray void. "Danny!" I screamed, the sound tearing out of my throat so hard I tasted blood, a raw, animal noise of absolute panic. I lunged for him, my fingers grazing the fabric of his windbreaker, but I grabbed nothing but empty cold air. He was gone, swallowed by the drop, and the only thing that answered me was the echo of my own voice bouncing off the canyon walls. I skidded to my knees on the treacherous rock, clawing at the stone, peering over the rim with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The world narrowed down to that terrible, empty space where my brother used to be. It was 60 feet straight down to the talus slope, a jagged collection of boulders and deadfall that looked like a jaw waiting to snap shut. I watched him fall, a small ragdoll shape tumbling through the mist, bouncing once off a protruding root ball before hitting the bottom. The sound of the impact was the worst part. A wet, heavy thud, followed by the sickening crack of branches snapping under his weight. Then, silence. A profound, absolute silence that felt heavier than the mountain itself, rushing in to fill the space where his laughter had been just seconds ago. I couldn't move. My brain simply refused to process the reality of what I had just witnessed, locking my muscles in a paralysis of shock. I stared down at the unmoving bundle of blue nylon far below, waiting for him to stand up, to wave, to cry out in pain. Anything would have been better than that stillness, that terrible lack of motion that signaled a broken neck or a stopped heart. I was the older brother, the protector, the one responsible for bringing him home safe to Mom and Dad. In one careless second, I had failed at the only job that mattered, and the guilt hit me harder than the vertigo. I tried to find a way down, scanning the cliff face for handholds, but it was a sheer vertical drop of wet moss and crumbling slate. Even with ropes, it would have been a technical descent. Free climbing it in a panic was a suicide mission that would leave my parents with 2 dead sons. I slumped back against a boulder, shaking violently, tears blurring my vision until the forest dissolved into a watery gray smear. I was trapped on the high ground, a useless spectator to my brother's death, waiting for the silence to become permanent. Time stretched and warped, seconds feeling like hours as I waited for a sign of life that I knew wasn't coming. Nausea rolled over me in waves, the taste of bile rising in my throat as I imagined explaining this to the sheriff. I closed my eyes, praying to a God I hadn't thought about in years, begging for a miracle, for a rewind button on the last minute of my life. I was preparing myself for the grief, building the walls up to contain the screaming that was building inside my chest. I felt utterly alone, abandoned by the universe in that cold, gray sector of the woods. But I wasn't alone. The silence that I thought was the end was suddenly shattered, not by the wind, but by a violent disturbance in the timber behind me. It started as a vibration in the rock under my knees, a rhythmic trembling that grew rapidly into the sound of heavy timber snapping like matchsticks. Something was moving through the dense forest with the speed of a freight train and the subtlety of a landslide, heading directly for the cliff edge. I turned my head, wiping the tears away, expecting to see a rock slide or a bear charging through the brush to finish me off. The vibration hit me first, traveling up through the soles of my boots and rattling my teeth before the sound even registered. It wasn't the chaotic rumble of a rock slide. It was rhythmic, heavy, and getting louder with terrifying speed. Thump, snap, thump, crack. The dense wall of manzanita and young firs behind me was being parted by something that treated the forest like it was made of paper. My first instinct was a grizzly bear, one of the massive coastal browns that wander up this far, charging in a blind rage at the smell of fear or blood. I curled into a ball covering my head, expecting to be mauled before I could even process my brother's death. But bears grunt. They huff and roar when they charge, making a noise that warns everything in their path to move. This thing was silent except for the destruction of the brush it was plowing through, moving with a singular, terrifying focus. The snapping of branches sounded like gunfire, getting closer, 50 yards, 30 yards, 10. The air pressure seemed to drop, sucking the breath out of my lungs as a massive displacement of air rushed ahead of the creature. I squeezed my eyes shut, paralyzed by the primal certainty that I was about to be turned into meat by an apex predator. Then the tree line exploded outward, showering me with pine needles and bark dust as the intruder breached the clearing. I looked up, unable to help myself, and my brain stalled completely, unable to categorize the silhouette that blocked out the sun. It wasn't a bear on all fours, and it wasn't a man. It was a wall of dark, matted fur standing on two legs. It was easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as a doorway, tapering down to a waist that looked like solid, corded muscle. It moved with a fluidity that defied its size, a blur of reddish-black motion that seemed to absorb the light around it. The smell hit me instantly, a pungent, overpowering wave of wet earth, skunk, and raw musk that made my eyes water. It was the scent of something ancient and wild, a biological signature that triggered a deep lizard brain panic I didn't know I possessed. I pressed my back against the boulder, making myself as small as possible, waiting for the inevitable backhand that would crush my skull. I saw the flash of skin on its face, dark, leathery, and weathered, and the heavy brow ridge that shadowed eyes I was too terrified to meet. It was a nightmare made flesh, a creature from the stories my grandfather used to tell to scare us straight. But the attack never came. The creature thundered past me, passing within 3 feet of where I huddled, close enough that I felt the wind of its passage ruffle my hair. It didn't slow down, didn't turn its massive head to look at me, didn't acknowledge my existence in any way. I was insignificant to it, a rock in the stream, unworthy of even a second glance. Its attention was fixed entirely on the edge of the cliff, on the exact spot where Danny's sneakers had slipped seconds ago. It knew. Somehow, without seeing the fall, it knew exactly what had happened and where he had gone. The footsteps were heavy, shaking the granite shelf with each impact, but they were also deliberate and calculated. This wasn't a panic run. It was a rescue sprint. I watched the muscles in its massive legs ripple under the fur as it drove itself forward, covering the ground in strides that were impossibly long. It reached the lip of the canyon in 2 seconds, its momentum carrying it dangerously close to the drop that had swallowed my brother. I gasped, thinking it was going to go over the edge by mistake, crashing down onto the rocks below in a pile of broken bones. It stopped on a dime right at the precipice, its toes gripping the slick stone with a dexterity that no boot could match. It peered over the edge, leaning out further than any human would dare, scanning the drop with an intensity that was palpable. I saw its head snap to the side, locking onto something below, Danny's body, and its posture shifted instantly from observation to action. It didn't howl or beat its chest. It let out a soft, sharp exhale, like a diver preparing to plunge into deep water. I watched in stunned disbelief as it turned around, presenting its massive back to the void, and crouched low. It reached out with hands the size of baseball mitts, gripping a sturdy root system and a jutting rock with confidence. It wasn't looking for a way around. It was going down. The monster that I thought was coming to kill me was voluntarily entering the kill zone, lowering itself over the lip of the cliff with a terrifying, silent grace. I forced my body to move, dragging myself on my stomach through the dirt until my head hung over the precipice, dreading what I would see. I expected to watch the creature plummet, to see gravity claim another victim on that slick, unforgiving rock face. But instead of falling, the massive beast was moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that defied every law of physics I understood. It was descending the vertical wall face in, finding handholds and toeholds in the slate that I couldn't even see from above. Its muscles rippled under the dark fur, locking and unlocking with precision, lowering 800 pounds of weight as gently as a spider on a thread. It moved faster than a human climber with ropes, utilizing a strength that was mechanical in its efficiency. I saw its fingers, thick, leathery digits tipped with hard nails, hook into tiny cracks in the granite, supporting its entire bulk with a casual ease. It didn't scramble or slip. It flowed down the rock, its movements silent and calculated, treating the deadly drop like a staircase. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as it navigated the overhang that had sent my brother into the void. It was an apex predator in its element, displaying a mastery of the terrain that made my own clumsy hiking look pathetic. When it reached the bottom of the ravine, it dropped the last few feet to the talus slope, landing in a crouch that absorbed the impact without a sound. It was standing directly over Danny now, who was lying twisted in a pile of ferns, his blue windbreaker the only bright color in a world of gray and green. My heart stopped again, the fear shifting from the fall to the creature itself. I thought I was watching a scavenger claiming a meal, that I was about to witness the final gruesome end of my brother's life. I wanted to look away, to spare myself the image, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the scene below. But the creature didn't strike. It slowed down. It approached Danny's broken form with a sudden, shocking tenderness, lowering its massive head to sniff at his face. I saw it pause, listening, perhaps checking for the shallow rhythm of a heartbeat or the wheeze of breath. Then it reached out with those enormous hands. It didn't grab him by the leg or drag him like a kill. It slid one palm under his neck and the other under his knees. It scooped him up, adjusting its grip until Danny was pressed against its chest, cradled securely in the crook of its massive arm. The image broke my brain. A monster from a nightmare holding a 12-year-old boy with the gentle reverence of a mother holding an infant. Danny looked so small against that wall of dark fur, his limbs dangling limp, his head lolling back against the creature's shoulder. The beast shifted its weight, testing the balance of the load, ensuring that the boy was secure before it turned back to the cliff face. It wasn't taking him into the woods. It wasn't running off with a prize. It looked up, straight at the rim of the canyon where I was lying, and locked onto the ascent route. It began to climb back up, a feat that should have been impossible with only 3 limbs available for purchase. It held Danny tight against its chest with its left arm, using only its right arm and 2 legs to scale the 60-foot wall. The power required to lift that much mass one-handed was staggering, a display of raw torque that vibrated the rock I was lying on. It moved methodically, grunting softly with the effort, its claws scratching against the stone as it hauled itself upward, foot by foot, fighting gravity for my brother's life. I could hear its breathing now, heavy and wet, getting louder as it closed the distance to the top. I saw the sweat glistening on its dark skin, the strain in the cords of its neck, the absolute focus in its amber eyes. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It was a conscious being engaged in a rescue mission, risking its own life on the wet rock to save a stranger. I lay frozen, my face inches from the edge, watching the impossible rise up to meet me. The smell of musk and wet pine grew stronger, choking me as the gap between us shrank to nothing. A massive hair-covered hand slammed onto the ledge just a foot from my nose, the black nails digging into the dirt for the final pull. The stone groaned under the weight, and I scrambled backward, crab-walking on my hands and heels to give it space. The creature heaved itself up and over the rim, cresting the cliff with a surge of power that shook the ground. It rose to its full height, towering over me, blocking out the sun, with my brother still tucked safely against its heaving chest. The creature stood on the ledge like a statue carved from shadow and fear, towering over me with the wind whipping its dark fur. I was shaking so hard my teeth rattled, convinced that this rescue was just a prelude to something worse, a predator securing its meal. But it didn't roar, and it didn't bare its teeth in a threat display. It just stood there, breathing heavily from the climb. It held Danny against its chest with a protective stillness, shielding him from the wind with its own massive body. I looked up at its face, expecting to see a monster. But the expression I found was unreadable, stoic, and terrifyingly calm. It took a hesitant step forward, the ground trembling slightly under its weight, and I flinched, scrambling backward until my spine hit the trunk of a pine tree. The creature stopped immediately, sensing my terror, and made a low, soft sound in its throat, a chuffing noise like a horse blowing air. It wasn't aggressive, it was a calming signal, a deliberate attempt to lower the tension in the air. It slowly knelt down, reducing its height to be closer to my level, though its shoulders were still wider than the length of my body. It extended its massive arms, holding Danny out toward me, offering him back like a precious, fragile gift it had retrieved from the dark. I forced my paralyzed body to move, crawling forward on my knees through the dirt, my hands trembling violently as I reached out. The creature waited with infinite patience, not letting go until it was certain I had a firm grip on Danny's jacket and legs. Its skin brushed against my hands, warm, leathery, and rough, radiating a biological heat that felt like a fever. It didn't just dump him into my lap. It transferred the weight slowly, carefully, ensuring I had him secure before it withdrew its massive hands. It was a moment of absolute impossible connection between two species, bridged by the shared fragility of the boy between us. Danny was unconscious, his face pale and scratched by briars, his breathing shallow but steady against my chest. I pulled him close, checking his pulse, crying with a relief so profound it felt like physical pain when I felt the thrum of life under his skin. He was broken, battered, and muddy, but he was alive. The fall should have turned him into a memory, but something had intervened. I looked up from my brother's face to the creature, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. I wasn't looking at a beast from a horror story. I was looking at a savior that had done what I was too weak to do. That's when it looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that I will never forget as long as I live. They were amber, deep set beneath a heavy brow, and filled with a shocking amount of emotion and intelligence. There was no animal vacancy there, no simple hunger. I saw concern, I saw curiosity, and I saw a weary sort of empathy. It studied my face, cataloging my fear and my gratitude, perhaps wondering if I was worth the effort it had just expended. It felt like being judged by an ancient god who had found me wanting as a protector, but had decided to spare me the grief anyway. It didn't linger for a thank you, and it didn't wait for a reward. The transaction was complete. It slowly stood back up to its full height, casting a long shadow over us one last time, blocking out the sun. It turned its massive head, checking the wind, checking the tree line, ever the guardian of its territory. Then, with a fluidity that shouldn't be possible for something of that size, it stepped back toward the dense brush. It didn't crash away or break branches. It slipped into the shadows like smoke, vanishing instantly into the green wall of the forest, as if it had never been there. I sat there clutching my brother in the dirt, listening to the silence of the woods return, wondering if my mind had snapped and hallucinated the whole thing. But the smell of musk still hung heavy and pungent in the air, and the massive wet footprints on the granite were undeniable proof. Then, in the distance, I heard the faint shouting of voices, the search party and the sheriff's deputies my parents must have called. They were coming with ropes, stretchers, and the noise of the rational world, bringing civilization back into my nightmare. I wiped the tears and dirt from my face, preparing my story, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of a lunatic. How do you tell a sheriff that a monster played paramedic? How do you tell your parents that a beast from a campfire story saved their son when their oldest boy couldn't? I looked down at Danny, who was starting to groan and shift as he woke up, and I realized he wouldn't remember a thing about the climb. The burden of this truth was going to be mine alone to carry, a heavy secret that was already building a wall between me and the rescuers crashing through the trees. When the first deputy burst through the tree line, red-faced and panting, the spell of the forest finally broke, shattered by the crackle of his radio. He found me sitting in the dirt, rocking back and forth, holding Danny's head in my lap while he groaned in semi-consciousness. More men followed, EMTs in bright yellow vests, search and rescue volunteers with dogs, my parents screaming our names. The noise was overwhelming, a chaotic wave of civilization crashing into the silent sanctuary where a miracle had just occurred. They swarmed us, checking vitals, shouting commands, and loading Danny onto a backboard, treating the scene like a standard extraction. I tried to tell them immediately, grabbing the sheriff by his sleeve, desperate to make him understand that there was something else in the woods. It brought him back, I stammered, pointing at the cliff edge. A giant, a creature. It climbed down and got him. The sheriff stopped writing in his notebook and looked at me with a heavy, pitying expression that made my stomach turn. He didn't look at the tracks. He didn't scan the tree line. He looked at my dilated pupils and my shaking hands and wrote off my testimony before I even finished the sentence. "You're in shock, son," he said gently, putting a hand on my shoulder like he was calming a spooked horse. "Trauma does strange things to the memory. Your brain is trying to make sense of a terrible fall." He explained it away with practiced ease. Danny must have hit a ledge or gotten hung up in a tree, and I had hallucinated the rescue to cope with the helplessness. They constructed a logical narrative right there in the dirt. A lucky fall, a resilient kid, and an older brother losing his mind from stress. The truth was too big to fit in their report, so they simply edited it out. My parents were no better. They were so consumed by the hysterical relief of finding Danny alive that they didn't care how it happened. They hugged me, crying, thanking God for the miracle, but when I tried to whisper about the hairy man, my dad just squeezed me tight and shushed me. "It's over," he said. "Don't think about it anymore. Just be glad he's safe." I realized then that they needed the world to make sense. They couldn't accept a version of reality where monsters saved their children. I was isolated in the middle of a reunion, the only one burdened with the knowledge of the impossible. The final nail in the coffin came when Danny fully woke up in the ambulance, blinking against the harsh lights. I leaned in, hoping he would remember the fur, the smell, the gentle arms that carried him up the wall. "Do you remember the climber?" I asked, desperate for a witness. He just looked at me with hazy, confused eyes and shook his head. "I remember slipping," he whispered. "Then I woke up here." The concussion had wiped the slate clean. The only other person who had touched the creature had no memory of it, leaving me stranded on an island of truth that no one else could see. At the hospital, the doctors called it a medical anomaly, staring at the x-rays with furrowed brows. A 60-foot fall onto rock should have resulted in catastrophic trauma, shattered pelvis, spinal cord injury, internal bleeding. Instead, Danny had a broken wrist, a concussion, and a landscape of deep bruising. but nothing fatal. "He's the luckiest kid in the state," the surgeon told us. "It's like something broke his fall." I stood in the corner of the room, biting my tongue until it bled, wanting to scream that someone broke his fall, not something. I stopped talking about it after that week, burying the story deep inside where it festered like an infected splinter. I became the quiet kid, the one who stared out the window during class, alienated from my friends who worried about prom and football. They were living in a safe, small world, and I had seen the edges of the map where the dragons lived. The story became a private ghost, a shadow that walked with me down the school hallways, reminding me that reality was thinner than everyone thought. But silence didn't mean I forgot. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber eyes staring back at me from the tree line. I felt the phantom weight of the creature's gaze on my neck whenever I walked near the woods, a sensation that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. I knew it was still out there, moving through the shadows, and I knew that our business wasn't finished. The forest had saved my brother, but it had claimed a piece of me in exchange, and eventually, I knew I would have to go back to the ridge to find out why. It took me 5 years to work up the courage to return to Split Ridge, 5 years of nightmares and therapy trying to undo the knot in my chest. I avoided that sector of the state park like it was radioactive, driving the long way around just to avoid seeing the peak in the distance. But the pull of the place was relentless, a gravity that tugged at me whenever the wind blew from the north or the leaves started to turn. Eventually, the need to know if it was real outweighed the fear of the memory. I hiked back up on a Tuesday morning, my boots crunching on the familiar gravel, expecting to find nothing but empty woods and bad memories. I reached the overlook where Danny had slipped, my heart rate spiking as I approached the edge, half expecting to see the ghost of the creature standing there. The cliff was empty, just wind-scoured granite and the endless drop that had almost claimed my family. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, trying to reconcile the monster in my head with the peaceful view in front of me. I turned to leave, feeling foolish for expecting a sign, when a flash of unnatural symmetry caught my eye in the brush. Just off the game trail, hidden behind a screen of manzanita, was something that stopped me cold. There were 3 small columns of flat slate stones, balanced with a precision that defied the wind and the vibration of the earth. They weren't random piles of scree pushed together by a snowplow or a landslide, they were architectural. Each stack was about a foot high, tapering from a wide base to a single precarious capstone that should have toppled in a breeze. They were spaced perfectly evenly apart, forming a small triangle that pointed directly toward the cliff edge. It looked like a marker, a memorial, or a boundary line drawn in geology. I knelt down to examine them, my hands hovering over the rough stone without touching it, feeling a strange static charge in the air. The moss on the rocks was undisturbed, meaning they hadn't been rolled there recently. They had been carefully selected and placed. No hiker builds cairns this far off the trail, and certainly not in a spot so hidden that you have to push through thorns to find it. This was a private message, a signal meant for an audience of one. It felt intimate, like finding a handwritten note left on a windshield in an empty parking lot. A nervous, dangerous curiosity took hold of me, a need to verify that this was an active communication and not just a relic of the past. I reached out with a trembling finger and pushed the top stone of the center stack. It clattered to the ground with a sharp sound that seemed too loud in the quiet forest. Then, feeling like a vandal in a church, I knocked over the entire middle column, scattering the stones into the dirt. I wanted to see if the forest would notice. I wanted to see if the caretaker was still on duty. I left the ridge walking fast, looking over my shoulder every few steps, terrified that I had just insulted something powerful. I stayed away for 3 days, letting the anxiety stew in my gut, imagining the creature returning to find its work destroyed. When I finally hiked back up on the 4th day, I approached the spot with a sense of dread, expecting to find the stones scattered or gone entirely. Instead, I stopped dead in the trail, the breath knocked out of me. The middle stack was back. It wasn't just a haphazard pile of rubble, it was rebuilt exactly as it had been, stone for stone, balanced with the same impossible grace. Actually, it was slightly different. The capstone was new. It was a smooth white piece of quartz that hadn't been there before, gleaming like a beacon in the gray slate. It wasn't just a repair, it was an acknowledgement. I had knocked on the door and something from the other side had opened it and waved back. The realization made my skin crawl and my heart soar at the same time. From that day on, the rock piles became a silent language between me and the guardian of the ridge. I never knocked them over again. That felt too disrespectful. But I would leave a small stone of my own on the ground nearby. When I returned weeks later, my stone would be incorporated into the stack, lifted from the dirt and given a place of honor in the structure. It was a slow-motion conversation spanning years, a way of saying, I'm still here, and I remember. The creature was letting me know that I wasn't crazy, that the bond forged on the cliff face was still holding strong. Danny passed away last winter, not from a fall or a monster, but from a mundane aneurysm that stole him in his sleep at 42. We had spent our whole lives waiting for the other shoe to drop after that day on the cliff, convinced he was living on borrowed time. When the call finally came, it felt like a clerical error in the universe's filing system, a quiet theft rather than a tragedy. The funeral was a blur of black coats and freezing rain, the kind of gray day where the world feels permanently colder. I stood by his grave, expecting to feel a sense of closure, but all I felt was a restless, magnetic itch under my skin. After the service, the family scattered like leaves in a storm, everyone retreating into their own private silos of grief to cope. My parents looked small and broken, the final light going out of their eyes now that their miracle boy was gone for good. I tried to go back to my routine, to my job and my empty house, but nothing fit the way it used to. The silence in my living room was deafening, amplified by the realization that I was the only one left who knew the full story of his life. The secret of the ridge felt heavier now, a burden I was carrying for a ghost who didn't even remember the weight of it. It started about a week later, a physical sensation of being pulled, like a fishhook snagged in my sternum with the line leading west. It wasn't nostalgia or a desire to visit a memorial. It was a summons that ignored logic and reason. I'd be washing dishes or driving to work, and suddenly I'd smell pine resin and wet stone, distinct and overwhelming in the sterile air. My dreams shifted from the usual anxieties to vivid, high-definition replays of the cliff face. But this time, the creature wasn't leaving. It was waiting. It felt like the forest itself was calling in a debt or demanding a debriefing now that the contract had changed. I fought the urge for a month, telling myself that going back to the site of his trauma was morbid and unhealthy. I told myself that the rock piles and the creature were just coping mechanisms I'd invented to deal with childhood PTSD. But grief has a way of dragging the past up by the roots, exposing things you thought were buried under concrete and time. The pull became a physical ache, a restlessness that made it impossible to sit still in a chair for more than 10 minutes. I realized I wasn't running to the woods. I was being reeled in by them. The story had started on that ridge, and it needed to end there. I packed my gear on a Tuesday, throwing essentials into a bag with the autopilot motion of a sleepwalker obeying a command. The drive to the state park felt like moving through a tunnel, the world outside the windshield blurring into gray static. As I turned onto the gravel service road, the air pressure in the car seemed to drop, my ears popping as if I were descending in a plane. The woods looked different this time, darker, taller, more imposing than the public park I remembered from my youth. It wasn't a recreational area anymore. It was a cathedral, and I was a pilgrim returning to the altar to make a confession. My knees complained with every step up the incline, a painful reminder that I wasn't the 16-year-old kid who could sprint up this hill. The trail was overgrown, nature reclaiming the path as if trying to discourage casual visitors from finding the overlook. But as I hiked, the familiarity of the terrain washed over me, the muscle memory of the route taking over my conscious thought. I found myself looking for the old markers, the twisted roots and the scarred trunks where I had paused to catch my breath years ago. The silence returned, that heavy, expectant quiet that I hadn't felt in decades, signaling I was crossing a border. When I finally broke through the brush to the cliff edge, the wind hit me with the scent of ozone and damp earth, stinging my eyes. I stood on the exact slab of granite where I had knelt and prayed all those years ago, looking down into the gray void. The drop was just as terrifying and absolute as it had been that day, a vertical maw waiting to swallow the careless. But instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of arrival, a locking into place like a key sliding into a tumbler. I wasn't just visiting a gravesite. I was reporting for duty. I stood there, breathless, and spoke my brother's name into the wind, waiting to see if the guardian was still listening. I realized then that I hadn't come back to say goodbye to Danny. I had come back to tell him that the boy was gone. The creature was the only other living soul that had held my brother, the only one who had fought for his life as hard as I had. It felt necessary to close the loop, to inform the Savior that the life he saved had finally run its course. It was a bizarre, primal courtesy, a death notification delivered to a species that doesn't have phones or mail. I waited, feeling the eyes of the forest open, knowing that the message had been received and an audience was gathering. So here I am, a man made of old bones and bad knees, leaning heavily on a hiking stick where I once stood on young, strong legs. The wind bites through my jacket, sharper than I remember from my youth, but the forest itself feels warm, almost expectant. It's a stillness that isn't empty. It's the quiet of a room when someone walks in and stands just out of your line of sight. I don't need to see him to know he's here. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up in that familiar electric salute. The woods are holding their breath, waiting for me to finally say the words I've held inside my chest for a lifetime. I scan the tree line, looking for that massive dark silhouette among the deep shadows of the firs. I don't see the fur or the amber eyes directly this time, but I see the way the birds have gone silent in the western quadrant. I smell that faint, unmistakable scent of wet earth and ancient musk drifting on the updraft, a smell that terrifies most but comforts me. He is there, just behind the veil of the undergrowth, keeping his distance but acknowledging the return of the boy who watched him work. It feels like a reunion between two veterans who served in the same war but never learned each other's names. "He's gone," I say out loud, my voice cracking and sounding small against the vastness of the ravine. "Danny, the one you brought back. He had a good life because of you." The words hang in the air, and for a moment the wind dies down completely, as if the forest is listening to the eulogy. I feel a shift in the pressure, a heavy, somber acknowledgement rippling through the trees. It isn't grief as humans know it, but a recognition of the cycle, a nod from one apex survivor to another about the fragility of the things we try to protect. I've spent 40 years listening to people call them monsters, seeing the tabloids and the horror movies that paint them as bloodthirsty beasts. They hunt for them with guns and cameras, desperate to mount a trophy or prove a theory, completely missing the truth staring them in the face. A monster doesn't risk its life on a wet cliff face to save a clumsy child it has no reason to care about. A monster doesn't cradle a broken body with hands that could crush steel, showing a tenderness that shames most men. I know what lives in these woods, and it isn't a nightmare. It's a neighbor. He is a guardian, a remnant of a time when the world was wilder and the lines between man and nature weren't so sharply drawn. He watches over the places we have forgotten, patrolling the ridges and the valleys where our signals fade to static. I think about the rock piles, the silent messages, the years of quiet coexistence that proved we aren't enemies. He didn't just save my brother that day. He saved me from a life of cynicism, showing me that mercy exists in the wildest, darkest corners of the earth. We are not alone out here, and we are not unguarded. I reach into my pocket and pull out a small, flat river stone I brought from the valley floor, placing it gently on the granite ledge. It's my final contribution to the cairn, my last message to the watcher before my own clock runs out. I don't expect to ever climb this ridge again. The trail is too steep and my heart is too tired to make the journey. This is goodbye, a closing of the circle that began with a scream and ends with a whisper. I turn my back on the cliff, feeling the heavy gaze bore into my shoulder blades one last time, a weight that feels like a blessing. So, if you are ever hiking the deep trails and the woods go suddenly, impossibly quiet, don't reach for your gun. Don't panic and run, because you can't outrun what moves through these trees. Just stop, show some respect, and remember that you are walking through a living room that doesn't belong to you. If you are lucky, and if your heart is right, you might just feel that heavy, protective presence watching your back. Bigfoot isn't a story to scare children. He's the reason some of them make it home when they shouldn't. I walk back down toward the car, the sun setting behind the ridge, casting long shadows that stretch across the path. The forest feels different now, lighter, as if the secret I carried has finally been laid to rest. I don't know if anyone will believe an old man's confession, but the truth doesn't need an audience to be real. I know who caught my brother. I know who built the stone towers. And I know that tonight, when the moon rises over Split Ridge, a giant will be standing watch, guarding the ghost of the boy he saved.